Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm an investigative journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face today. And they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Hit the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. My guest this week is Richard Heinberg. He is a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute and has dedicated his adult life to understanding the complexity of the environmental crisis and where it collides with energy use and our economy. Richard's got a fascinating overview of the crisis because he doesn't come at it from one angle or one area of expertise. He's very much got a bird's eye view on the problem, and I would highly recommend anybody go and visit his website and read his essays, which are wide-ranging and filled with nuggets of facts, ideas, solutions. They're absolutely fascinating. This conversation ranges from discussing energy use and peak energy to policies that could ration energy, which was a really exciting part, and ultimately social cohesion. Why we need to collaborate in order to make tough choices, why we will fail without that sense of cooperation, and why increasing economic inequality is making that social cohesion less and less likely every day. I hope you enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. If you love the episode, support Planet Critical on Patreon, where you'll also get access to the transcripts of these interviews. The link is in the description box below, and a huge thank you to everyone who's supporting the project. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on Planet Critical.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
I seem to be sort of making my way through all the fellows at the Post-Carbon Institute. I feel like I found my brethren, but you're all across the pond. We emailed very briefly about what we were going to discuss, and I've changed my mind, if that's all right. I would
Sure.
love to go through your recent essay on social cohesion, and what's happening politically and how that relates to the climate crisis, and what we need to change democratically in order to best tackle the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face.
Okay, sure.
Just a small ask.
Yeah, I'm up for that.
All right, fantastic. So maybe first of all, before we dive into that, if you could give a brief background, your history, your bio for listeners, and then we'll delve into that.
My day job is as senior fellow for Post-Carbon Institute. And so basically that involves doing a lot of writing, public speaking, so on. So I've written 14 books, mostly on energy and climate issues, everything related to the environment. I don't have any specific educational background to help me with that. I was trained as an artist and musician. But starting when I was in my 20s, I realized that society was on a basically unsustainable path. And I've spent my entire adult life trying to figure out why that is and what we should do about it.
Oh, how interesting. Do you think that not having a particular academic background gives you a certain advantage when dealing with the research?
There are advantages and disadvantages. The advantage, of course, is that I'm less likely to get caught in sort of a silo of thinking. It's easier for me to sort of transgress boundaries of disciplines. But on the other hand, I suppose credibility is reduced somewhat. It always helps if you can say you have a PhD in, climate science or something like that. You get asked more often for your comments by, I think, probably by mainstream publications, but I try to make up for that with volume.
I mean, 14 books.
Yeah.
That's a hell of an output.
Right. And hundreds of essays, so it's all on my site, richardheinberg.com.
I think it's interesting because, everybody I speak to is sort of getting to that stage of like, don't trust us experts. We have not done enough to stop the headlong rush towards destruction. The atomization of studies is part of the problem. And then on the other hand, you've got people like Naomi Klein. She's such a famous example of somebody that she didn't even graduate, as far as I remember correctly, because she just kept, being a fantastic journalist. And so leaving university to go off and do that. So I think you're in a great position to be one of the researchers and sort of truth tellers of our time. And I would hope that the mainstream would pay more attention.
Well, I hope so too. Thank you.
So, as far as I can see from having Googled you, what you became quite well known for was the peak oil and peak energy stuff a few years ago. And I had a question. Hang on, let me slow down and think about this. How energy relates to the economy seems to be sort of the critical intersection when dealing with the ecological crisis. And yet it seems to be the place where people disagree the most as well. So you get degrowth scholars talking about, just switching over to renewables, without talking about the fossil fuels that would take, or, the fact that renewables can never produce the amount of energy that we need. You also get some people talking about peak oil and others saying that peak oil hasn't happened, or, it's a very, very confusing space. And it makes it very difficult for the layman, to establish. I mean, could we discuss briefly before we get into this social cohesion thing? What is going on with our energy demands? Because another thing and this is what I wrote down, is that you wrote in a recent essay about limits to growth that the growth of energy use has actually slowed in recent years. It's only 2% compared to, I think, 5.4 decades previously.
Right.
What is going on with our energy demands? How does it correlate with GDP, and what can we do?
It's a huge topic.
Yeah.
Well, basically, most of our energy, about 85% of our energy, comes from fossil fuels. Coal, oil, and natural gas. Actually, in order of the highest to the least, oil is our biggest source, a single source of energy. So, fossil fuels are, of course, finite, depleting natural resources. Nature isn't making any more of them, at least at any speed that would make a difference to modern industrial society. So, with every unit of coal, oil, or natural gas that we take out of the ground and burn, it gets harder to access what's left, because we harvest the stuff using the low-hanging fruit principle. We go after the oil, natural gas, and coal. It's easiest to get the highest quality stuff first and leave the nasty, dirtier, harder to get stuff for later. Well, we've been doing this for so many decades now that it really is getting later, especially when it comes to oil. New oil discoveries last year were at their lowest level since, in 75 years. So now we're at a point where really, if we need new supplies, we have to go to extreme lengths, like the Canadian tar sands, or fracking in the US, which is, extremely technology intensive and not very profitable for the companies that specialize in it, and so on. So the cheap, easy stuff is gone. We're at the end of a certain era of, cheap, abundant energy that made the 20th century what it was, this period of unprecedented economic growth and technological invention, all this stuff. This is what we grew up in. This is what we take for granted as being, reality, the normal. This is normally how people should live. We should all be driving cars and watching television. But that's not how people lived before fossil fuels, and it's not how people will live after fossil fuels. Fossil fuels made all of this stuff possible because they're these magical sources of energy that were created by nature without any effort required on the part of human beings. Now, the question is, where do we go from here? And that's not an easy question to answer, because we would all like to be able to continue living the way we are just by by somewhat other means, build some solar panels or wind turbines and electrify everything. And we can go on pretty much the same. But it's not, even if, and that's a huge if, these alternative energy sources are capable of supplying that much energy, at that scale, making that transition is an enormous job. When we say electrify everything, well, it's two words, but it implies, trillions of dollars of decades of effort in technologies that in some cases don't even exist yet for high heat industrial processes and things like that. So, policymakers are stuck. Their constituents require them to, supply more economic growth, which requires more energy. And at the same time, they know that burning all of these fossil fuels is causing a climate emergency. And that, somewhere in the back of their minds is the recognition that, fossil fuels are finite and we can't keep doing this forever. So there's this idea of the energy transition. We have to transition away from fossil fuels. And that, in policy circles, that's kind of it's a mantra now. The energy transition has to happen. But nobody has a real plan for how that will actually work. It's just a phrase.
Well, and as far as I understand as well, having spoken to some of your colleagues, um, even if there was an energy transition, it doesn't really mean anything because we will still have to massively reduce energy consumption in order to use renewable energy. And the fact that renewable energies require a huge amount of resources, finite resources, and fossil fuels in order to be built and then to be rebuilt every 20 years is often never factored in as well. But there's something you said that I want to just nitpick on. You
Sure.
said constituents demand from policymakers continued economic growth. Now, is that true? Is that what constituents demand? I mean, constituents want a job. Constituents want access to certain health services, or basic universal services. But I mean, as we're seeing, the accumulation of wealth in the world does not trickle down. So surely a lot of constituents would be happy for redistribution rather than growth.
Right. But that's not how the choices are framed for them.
Mm.
When was the last time you saw a politician run on a platform of degrowth, and say, well, you elect me and I'll make sure that the economy contracts in a manageable way. We'll make sure you have healthcare and food and the necessities, but we're going to have to give up a lot of perks on the outside and change our habits, and maybe we won't be able to fly in airplanes anymore and so on. But life will be okay. I mean, that's what policymakers should be saying, because that's the reality of the choices we have in front of us and so on. But none of them do, because economic growth is what they have been relying on for decades to make the system work. Just in terms of economic inequality, for example, more economic growth tends to lead to more economic inequality. The people at the top of the economic pyramid do better than the people at the bottom, and it's a natural process. And it would take a little while to explain why this wealth pump is continually pumping wealth up to the top of the economic pyramid, unless we have some kind of redistributive programs or progressive taxation, pretty soon the super wealthy basically take it all.
Mm.
Okay, so how do policymakers propose to deal with that? Through economic growth.
Yeah.
If the pie is continually growing in size, then even if you only have a tiny piece of it, well, that little piece will be growing too.
Mm.
But if the whole economic pie is shrinking, if we don't have economic growth, then that forces some hard choices. The only way you're going to keep the common person from really losing out is if you start taking a lot away from the super rich and redistributing it. And the super rich really don't like that idea.
Mm.
So the policymakers are stuck, constantly having to promise more economic growth, even as they, you know, actually most of them don't even realize that the fact that that economic growth is making the problems that they're trying to solve
Mm.
worse.
Mm. I've started to think recently about Trojan horse policies
Hmm.
because I think that a lot of the propositions coming from degrowth are really, really cool.
Yeah.
Almost sexy, 4-day work week and job guarantee and all this kind of stuff.
What's not to
Um,
like?
well, degrowth, that one word, that's what's not to like. That's what makes
Uh,
people panic in this sort of paradigm. And even thinking about the climate crisis and energy and all these things, they're really, unless something has a tangible impact on your life, it's very, very hard to sort of navigate the abstractions. That is, the climate crisis is coming and we're all going to be screwed in 10 to 20
hmm.
years, you know? So I've started to think about these Trojan horse policies. Like, how can you create policies that really, really speak to the most precarious of society, i.e., a job guarantee, i.e., universal basic services? I'm stealing all of this from degrowth, but you don't mention growth. You don't mention degrowth. You don't even mention the climate crisis. These are just sort of the positive repercussions of implementing policies that put people first and therefore planet.
Right.
Um, because it's as you said, like we're sort of stuck in this paradox, this paradoxical paradigm, and so surely the only way to get out is by using the same kind of language, but by slipping in progressive action. I don't know.
Well, it's a thought that has occurred to many others
Mm,
also, and there's a whole school of environmentalism that says, please do not, emphasize the hard choices we have to make. Please do not say degrowth. Just say, you know, um, circular economy. I mean, that's a good thing, right? Or reforestation as a way of dealing with climate change. Everybody wants more forests. So rather than talking about, how we would need to burn less fossil fuels, which might have some implications for, you know, my my planned vacation in Belize or something,
mm,
instead emphasize, planting more trees. Everybody wins. What's not to like?
mm.
And I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of policy jujitsu. Um, I have nothing against it, except for the fact that at some point, you know, the people will figure out that in fact, if we do these things, then the reality is that the economy will start to shrink, and we will face tough choices, and the people with the most power and the most wealth will be forced then to start giving some of it up, big chunks of it up, actually. And that's, push eventually comes to shove.
So degrowth actually depends on that redistribution clause.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't work without it, because if the economy shrinks and we don't redistribute wealth, then the people with the least just get shoved right off the table. They have nothing. And of course that I mean, aside from the obvious moral quandary, uh, that also makes it harder for policymakers, because they start losing constituents, and people get very angry, and this is when revolutions happen. When food gets too expensive or people can't afford it, when you have an affordability crisis for things like food, energy, and housing, people get really pissed off.
Well, aren't we kind of seeing that anyway? And this is a nice segue into social cohesion. People are pissed off. People have access to less, despite seemingly, the huge amount of growth and wealth that does exist in the world. So, what direction do you think that we're headed in? Because I keep wondering, I keep thinking about that fact, that little nugget, which is that there is 7 consecutive missed meals between peacetime and a revolution. Um, and given what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and the fact that they're exporters of the cheapest wheat to the most vulnerable nations, I think it's very likely that this is going to trigger a wave of revolutions around the world, whether they'll be socialist or whether they'll be, that grasping at the patriarchal authoritarian figure to come in and clean up the mess. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, for us modern, developed Western nations, so yeah, it took me a while to get to the right word there. What do you think? What changes would we need to see culturally and socially between people in order to tackle the crisis without it involving a secondary crisis?
It's tough because we've put it off so long
Yeah.
that the choices are really difficult. There's no way forward that's peaceful, that's equitable, that doesn't involve a climate catastrophe, that doesn't also require, massive redistribution, just basically canceling a whole lot of debt for people toward the bottom of the economic pyramid and taking a bunch of wealth away from people at the top and using it to, build the kind of infrastructure we'll need for a lower energy and more sustainable way of life. That's ultimately that's what would have to happen. How we get there, God knows. I mean, the when you put it that way, there are a lot of people who would say, "Yeah, that's right. That's what we need to do." But when you ask, who's who in public life is calling for that? What politicians are calling for it? Nobody, because they're just too much. It's minefields out there.
Mm. I think it's also inherently divisive as a
Mm,
as a concept, which isn't
yeah.
necessarily a bad thing. It's just stating the truth of the matter. Because what I found so interesting to see a few years ago was a chart detailing global wealth, and
Mhm.
to realize that me, my friends, all of us that are earning more than what we would consider very, very meager sums of money, we're in the 1% globally.
That's right.
So, it's
So
not just,
it becomes personal, doesn't it? Yeah.
Mm, yeah, it's not just about going for the billionaires um, after they come back from their space ejaculation trip. Um, it's also about, if you apply those policies to other people, you have to start applying them to self. And I wonder if that's the reason behind why socialist revolutions in the past have often failed. If you look at France, the old one, not the May 68 one, the off with their heads one, um, how power and wealth became concentrated again at the top. It's because people always think that there's somebody above them, right?
Hmm. And when people are living in big groups, nations, whatever, I mean, um, it really requires some kind of complex organization to make those things work. So you
Mm,
inevitably end up with some kind of social hierarchy. And I don't think social hierarchy in and of itself is a terribly evil thing, but it tends to get out of hand. The people at the top tend to make rules in such a way as to benefit themselves over the long run. And so the wealth pump is created and the wealth starts flowing upward again. You can level the whole thing out as happened in the 1780s in France, but then it just, before long you have Napoleon.
mhm,
It happens again and again through history. Now there are better systems than others, obviously. I mean, the U.S. has extreme wealth inequality. Someplace like Denmark has much less. And there are historical reasons for that, but there are also policy reasons. And we could do much better in terms of of maintaining kind of a level playing field. After all, people in the US and Western Europe are accustomed to a certain level of consumption that's way beyond the average per capita consumption of people in the global South. So what do we do about that? Do make direct wealth payments from the wealthy countries to the I think that's extremely unlikely to happen because if while that would be happening, the 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 wealthy countries of the North would be downsizing. So imagine yourself living in,
Hmm.
Great Britain or the United States, and you're feeling the pressure of degrowth. Things some of the perks are starting to fall away, and then the government says, "Oh well, we have to take even more and ship it down to Africa or South America or India or someplace so that they can improve their per capita consumption." That wouldn't go over very well. So it makes it very, very difficult.
We are interrupting regular broadcasting of Planet Critical to give a shout out to another climate centric, no bullshit podcast, Crazy Town. Crazy Town is a post Carbon Institute project hosted by Richard's colleagues and some of my guests. I'm sure you all remember the incredibly knowledgeable Jason Bradford, a biologist and farmer who joined me a few months ago to talk about the future of food systems and why people must learn to feed their community. In a few weeks' time, I'm also speaking with Asher Miller, the executive director of the Institute, about how to create complex systems. On Crazy Town, these two are joined by Rob Dietz, the Institute's program director. Together, these guys thrash out the most important topics and questions facing humankind with a commendable amount of humour and insight. Listening to them is like hanging around the campfire of the climate crisis. Yes, the night is long, but you couldn't ask for better company. Is there a school of thought that you're particularly excited about when thinking about these big picture
Mm.
problems?
Well, there's a policy that I think would be really helpful, and I've actually written about that lately, and it's cap and ration. And
So,
the word ration is not very popular these days. People don't like the idea because, of course, it brings to mind the idea of scarcity. But that's the reality. We are
mm,
entering a period of scarcity, and rationing is the most rational way of dealing with scarcity, and it has a long historical, um, you know, uh, precedent for doing that successfully. Rationing hasn't been successful every time it's been tried, but in Britain after World War II, people were better nourished under food rationing than they had been before the war and better than they were after food rationing ended
I didn't know
in the
that.
1950s. Yeah. Um, and that's pretty typical. It's food rationing is used not only as a way of dealing with scarcity, but also as an anti-poverty measure in many places, like the U.S. has food stamps. And that's basically a food rationing program. Nobody calls it that, but that's what it is. And it keeps, several million people from starving to death. It's a very successful program. Nobody would want to cancel it. Well, we're going to have to do something like that with energy because energy is the master resource. On a day-to-day basis, of course, it's not as important as food and water, but energy is what enables us to produce and deliver our food and water. So if we don't have energy, basically all modern society falls apart very,
Mhm.
very quickly. And we are, because of climate change and having to deal with that, and because fossil fuels are finite and depleting, we are approaching a period of energy scarcity. And we're starting to see that already with oil as a result of the Ukraine invasion. The International Energy Agency is saying that about 3 million barrels a day of Russian oil are probably going to not be available to the market, and there are no likely sources for replacing that much. So the International Energy Agency has just published a 10-point set of things that policymakers could take up from banning driving on Sundays to, incentivizing people not to fly in airplanes, all these sorts of things that are kind of emergency efforts.
Mm.
But over the long run, a much better policy would be energy rationing. And that can take several different forms. A British economist named David Fleming came up with a really good set of policy recommendations. He called tradable energy quotas. And there's been quite a lot of study of that. He came up with the idea back in the 1990s, but it's still being studied and discussed, and it's one of the best that I've seen so far.
Could you explicate it a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, every household would get uh, a a free set of energy rations for each week, right? And there would be a national committee to decide, the total cap on energy, fossil fuels, what's available, right? And with climate change in mind, so the amount of fossil fuels available to be rationed would constantly be declining.
Mm.
But you'd get your free ration each week. You'd still have to pay for the fuel, but you could trade your ration if you decided, well, I don't really need to drive in a big SUV. I can walk, or I can ride a bicycle, or I can do this or that. You'd have extra rations, and you could sell those, and so you'd actually get a benefit from using less energy. Now, of course, there are poorer people who really don't have those options. They're kind of stuck in uh, ways of using energy that are not as you know, conservative as they could be. And that there are ways that you could use the system to help subsidize those people while you find them other ways of meeting their basic needs that are more, energy uh, energy conservative. So th- there's a plan, and it's been it's been studied in Britain and Ireland. There's an Irish organization, FASTA, FEASTA, that is also looking at energy rationing, capping energy and rationing it. And a number of climate scientists are thinking along these lines now. So you don't see it being written. I wrote an essay about this just a couple of weeks ago, right? And and I had basically been invited by I won't name the name, but a big uh, environmental website uh, to write this piece for them. And I wrote it, and they said, "Oh well, it's not a good fit." And the reason, of course, is that they just don't want to talk about rationing. They
Oh.
all, you look at their website and it's all sort of good news stuff about energy from volcanoes, or, you know, but the tough choices nobody wants to talk about.
Mm. How interesting. Energy rationing. The thing that always frightens me about policies like these, though, whilst um
Mm.
individually fantastic, amazing, and you even have the benefit of another little fun fact about World War II is they did a longitudinal study of Britain's happiness and found that over a period of 50 years, Britons were happiest during World War II because they had a common enemy and a common goal, and they all had purpose, and they all had to ration and come together to defeat the enemy. So there's even, I think there would be a very positive sense of national capability and resourcefulness if everyone were to agree to ration their energy and sort of do it collectively.
That's the one thing we need more than anything else, the sense that we're all in this together.
Mm.
It's going to be a difficult time. We'll have to sacrifice, but we'll be doing it together, and it will be fair. If we have that, we can do it.
Well, I think if we can get there, fantastic. And I think the positive benefits on mental health would be actually amazing.
Mhm.
However, what I worry about is if we don't sort of fix the financial system and the little loopholes and the inequality alongside that, then essentially you'll see very precarious, you'll see an illegal market for energy rations. And you'll see, what else would you see? Yes, you would see wealthy people buying the energy rations of those who actually need them to power their home, but being forced to do something else. I don't know,
Right.
eat in summer or whatever. Um, Undoubtedly, you would see an illegal energy market spring up as well for
Right.
energy itself. So the thing that slightly worries at me when we speak about climate change policies and all of the things that need to be implemented, it's like, well, we need to fix the corruption that's present in the current system too. Otherwise, we will just delay the inevitable, which is, the impeding collapse of a dysfunctional oligarchic system.
Right. And that's why rationing systems, that's one of the reasons rationing systems sometimes fail, is because people don't trust. They see too much cheating going on around them, and they don't trust the system. They think it's being gamed, and therefore they refuse to participate in various ways, and they find ways to cheat themselves. So yeah, you're exactly right. And, when we started this conversation, yeah, I think you wanted to talk more about social cohesion.
Mm.
And that's basically what we are talking about.
Yeah.
If we're going to solve climate change without global catastrophe,
Yeah.
it's going to require social cohesion. We're going to have to work together and be willing to sacrifice together. And we're going to have levels of social trust that are much greater than they currently are. Right now, our social trust is actually evaporating, especially in countries like the US, where, there's so much political division that it's hard to get anything done, much less take on a huge, huge challenge like climate change. Sorry, I keep talking about problems.
No, that's what this podcast is all about. I'm just thinking of the how do we keep pushing down that problem? Barring a crisis event, how do we heal or improve social cohesion in
Right.
nations like the United States?
That is such an important question and such a difficult question. Well, first you look at what causes the decline in social cohesion. And one of the things is increasing economic inequality.
Hmm.
As inequality worsens, people stop trusting the system. They get cynical and they think, well, the people at the top are just serving themselves, which is mostly true, and that the system is working against me. And then if somebody comes along and says, well, it's that group that's causing this to happen. And if you listen to me, follow me, I'll get rid of those people or you know, reduce their social power and increase yours, and everything will be fine again. And it's not a often, sadly, that's framed in ethnic terms
Hmm.
or in terms of other sort of arbitrary designations of social groups that actually have nothing to do with the real problem. It's hard to go after the super wealthy and actually get them to pay their fair share. It's much easier to go after an ethnic group or other social group that's relatively powerless anyway and say, well, it's all their fault.
Hmm.
And, we'll just uh, pile on them, and that will somehow make things better. But that's the root of you know, the populist demagogue. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of those around the world because it's the ingredients are there to make it easy for them. So somehow we have to defeat that process of social demagoguery. Another thing we need is just a set of shared facts, information. And there again, there's some trends are working against us. Artificial intelligence is becoming so sophisticated that it's very difficult to tell truth from simulation. uh, and more so all the time. I saw just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was in Berkeley, California, social gathering, and there was an AI researcher there, and he had just an ordinary laptop, and he was able to demonstrate right on the spot, taking about a minute to, he said, well, what would you like a piece of artwork on, and you could say, well, how about a piece of artwork that's showing, a volcano with uh, a Greek hero and, just arbitrary stuff. And he tapped keys for a minute or two, and out came this actually, an artwork, piece of artwork that would have taken a highly trained commercial artist, probably 3 or 4 days at least
Mm.
to produce. And this was 30 seconds. So on one hand, imagine how many people this kind of technology could put out of work, producing not only artwork, but also text, articles, essays, um, news items, but also faked photographs, faked videos,
Deep fake.
deep fake, exactly. And it's cheap and it's fast and it's really hard to detect. So that's one, just one factor that's preventing us from moving in a direction of having, a sense of shared understanding of where we are, where we're going, and what we have to do.
Maybe we could make AI the great enemy that globally could come together against.
Yeah, right.
You think climate change is intangible? Well, how about this thing that nobody really understands?
Yeah. How do you regulate it? It's hard because, it uses technology that we all love and we all want more of. We all use computers all the time.
Mm, yeah. I think I have the vague hope that uh in terms of AI and like art and research and these kinds of things, that maybe that social demagoguery will kind of work in our favor because we can only really appreciate a thing. I think there's an element of only being able to appreciate a thing if there's that feeling that it came from somebody who is a fellow human being and therefore in a way just like you, and therefore you could achieve that too if
Mhm.
X, Y, and Z hadn't happened. So there's that sort of simultaneous narcissism and victimization that I think creates that sort of mystical quality around worshiping, our artistic idols.
Right.
And so I think people won't care as much when things come from AI. How can you have a relationship like, a computer made it? Cool. Once you get over the thing of like, oh, computers can make art now. Wow. And
I agree. Yeah, I would much rather listen to handmade music than computer generated music. Yeah.
handmade. That's the term we're gonna go back to. Um, oh, how interesting. We're sort of going off in all lots of directions here. It's great
Mhm.
fun. I'm trying to think like a kind of final topic to wrap up. Okay, I have a difficult question for you, actually.
But
Um, so you've been with the Post Carbon Institute for a while. There's been a lot of organizations like this that have been trying to preach the climate message for a long time. And, the first big book, at least as far as I can think, would be Limits to Growth as well by
mm,
Donella Meadows, and her co-authors. What have you guys been doing wrong for us to still be in this stage?
oh, I'm sure there's a long list. Uh, we're like Sisyphus, pushing the rock uphill because we've chosen a particularly difficult angle in this whole thing. I mean, you could say of the whole environmental movement, well, why or after 50 years since the limits to growth, hasn't the world awakened and dealt with all of these environmental issues? Well, of course, the reason is that people don't want to in the final analysis because it's hard.
Hmm.
It would require sacrifice. It would require giving something up. We've just been experiencing, and it's still going on, although we're getting toward the trail end of it. We've just been experiencing a period in human history unlike anything ever before.
Yeah.
Because of cheap, abundant fossil fuels, we've been able to do things that were literally miraculous in comparison with what people took for granted as, normal human life in previous millennia. You know, it's pointless to try to enumerate all these things, but just having cheap food and the sense of security that comes with modern urban existence and so on. It's a it's easy to take all this for granted and then to feel that it might be threatened because of climate change or because we might have to change our way of life somehow. It's really an uphill battle. So we at Post Carbon Institute have even made that worse by insisting on pointing out the tough choices rather than trying to finesse them. And, I respect the environmental organizations that try to finesse them by saying, oh, well, all the solutions are there. We don't have to really sacrifice anything. All we have to do is just build a bunch of solar panels really fast. That'll create, millions of jobs and everybody will be happy and so on. But, we're the ones over in the corner saying, yeah, but, where do all the minerals come from for all those solar panels? What do you do when they're worn out and you have to throw them away? What, there really are trade-offs. We really do have to make some hard choices. So I'm just amazed that Post Carbon Institute is still around, frankly, after we started in 2003. So what's that, 15 years?
Yeah.
Somehow, there's been an audience for this message that's just large enough to keep us going. And, I think I'm proud of the work we do. And hopefully that audience will grow, but it's a tough message.
I really like Post Carbon Institute for the toughness of the message and for the reality of the message. Because of the wealth of information that is on the Post Carbon Institute website. Now, when I go on any other kind of climate organization and see promises based on things like renewables, I'm like, no, don't trust you. No, bye. But I do wonder if generally the environmental movement needs to provide people with not more hope, but a genuinely positive, realistic vision for the future. That,
Sure.
yes, hard choices will have to be made. And yes, EasyJet and Ryanair and hopping around to different countries all the time might not be possible, but you could have more time with your family. You could pursue creative things. You could come to find a sense of purpose or I don't know, sort of escape the precarity of modern life nonetheless.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, our website, our public website is resilience.org. And I would say half the stories on resilience.org are exactly along the lines of what you've just been saying, how using less, but developing more of a sense of community actually makes you happier, and developing that sense of social cohesion, which is what we'll need to get through this. That's really, it's a reward. Sometimes social cohesion comes about as a result of wartime or natural disaster or whatever. So we may have some of that in store for us one way or the other. But if we have the attitude of willingness to engage with others and put ourselves out there and be willing to start the conversation, then it's even better.
Yeah. I have one final question that sort of popped up, and you may not have any data on this to answer it, but Gen Z have done a fantastic job of highlighting the climate crisis, and there's such a things as climate change influencers or climate change activists and all this kind of thing. Because of the nature of their MO, i.e., disseminating information through TikToks and through short blasts of content, Do you ever worry that the younger generation has not quite grasped the severity or the complexity of the situation that we find ourselves in, and therefore is perhaps doing damage to the movement? Because just to caveat this to listeners, a big thing that climate activists call for is the immediate stop of fossil fuels, which would send the entire world into chaos overnight
Yeah.
and would see millions starve and millions more freeze to death, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just not possible, but that's one of the main things they call for.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is a complex situation. It has history. It has complexity in terms of social dynamics and economics and all of these things. So, people, if they get involved in climate change communication, really need to do some homework and study all that stuff. But study it from a systems perspective. I mean, you can take a course in economics and just get dumbed down as a result, because economics as a discipline has a lot of false premises built into it. I've spent basically my whole adult life trying to get to the truth of all of these things that we've been talking about, and how the economy and climate change and energy and physics and all of these things relate to each other. And it's been a full-time job, and I'm still learning a lot. So I don't expect that everybody's going to get that right away, but it is a process. And I think environmental organizations owe it to their constituency to try to improve their literacy on all of these subjects, rather than just, as you say, finding a simple message that, may instantly appeal to some part of the reptilian brain, but doesn't really address the complexity of the real situation.
That's interesting. And yeah, I wonder how else to get people on board without appealing to the reptilian brain, because essentially, in a society of consumerism, that is essentially the feedback loop
Yeah.
that we're in.
Yep.
Education, education, education.
I know. Fortunately, we human beings are curious critters, so it is possible to get people to want to learn this stuff.
I
Worked
agree.
for me.
I have a huge amount of faith in people, increasingly so as I learn about this kind of stuff. Really, increasingly so. And I think I always like to think that our evolution as, sort of self-aware, conscious beings we lost instincts, but gained the ability to ask questions. And I think that capacity for asking questions is key. And I think getting people out of precarious economic systems and situations so that they have the time to reflect and ask questions and be creative is also key. People find a way.
Yeah, yeah.
Given the opportunity.
And most of us still have that luxury now. I mean, once you're actually in a survival situation, there's not that much time to try to reflect on, why is this happening, and what are the structural issues, and what are the best policies, and so on. You're just fighting for your life.
Yeah.
So while we have that space and time, it's good to use it.
Absolutely. Richard, who would you like to platform?
Somebody I've been recommending lately is my friend Stan Cox, who wrote a book on rationing, and also has written a book on the Green New Deal and beyond. So he's a fascinating individual. He works at a place called the Land Institute in Kansas, and they've been working for decades on creating perennial grain crops. Because if we had perennial grain crops, then we would be plowing every year. And yeah, I mean, it would have absolutely transformative implications for climate change and lots of other environmental issues. So, I mean, he's into lots of great stuff, and he's a brilliant guy. So he'd be terrific.
Oh, I would love to speak with him. Could you put us in touch?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Richard, thank you so much for your time. This was thrilling.
Oh, well, thank you, Rachel. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Good, I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about Richard's work, I've put links to his website in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it and you want access to the interview transcripts, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. A huge thank you to the Planet Critical patrons and community. This work wouldn't be possible without you. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.